The morning meeting at Sterling Capital was tense as a drawn bowstring. At the head of the table, CEO Eleanor Sterling, the billionaire power broker, tapped her pen coldly. "This company needs real investment advice. If necessary, I'm willing to listen to even the janitor." Laughter rippled through the room. She turned to a man cleaning windows in the back. "You there? If it were you, what would you invest in?" The janitor set down his cloth and looked directly at her. "Not in a company that's selling its soul to buy its reputation." The air froze, the entire room went silent. Eleanor stood paralyzed, not because of what he'd said, but because those eyes were strangely familiar. That afternoon, she gave an order: "Find me that employee's file immediately." Eleanor Sterling was 38 years old, a self-made billionaire, CEO of Sterling Capital, an investment fund that had once dominated Wall Street. For 6 years, she'd been known as the Steel Rose of finance, famous for being ruthless, cold, and obsessed with power. But behind that armor, she was a single mother who'd lost her only son due to a mistake in a risky investment deal, something that made her vow to never be weak again. In the basement of the Sterling building, Daniel Ross, 40 years old, worked the night shift as a janitor, cleaning floors with calloused hands. He'd once been a senior financial analyst at the same corporation. 6 years ago, he'd been falsely blamed for a fund collapse that destroyed many people's savings. He'd been fired, divorced, and lost custody of his 10-year-old daughter, Emma. After that scandal, he'd chosen to live in silence, working as a janitor to stay close to his daughter, who attended elementary school right next to Sterling Capital. But even as a janitor, Daniel still had the habit of reading financial reports every night to keep his mind sharp. He didn't know that this morning, fate would drag him back into the room that had destroyed his entire life. The boardroom had been full of executives in expensive suits, reviewing quarterly projections that looked good on paper but felt hollow. Eleanor had been growing frustrated with her advisory team. They told her what she wanted to hear, not what she needed to know. "Does anyone in this room have an original thought?" she'd snapped. "Or are we just going to keep recycling the same tired strategies?" Silence. That's when she'd noticed Daniel in the back corner, cleaning the windows with methodical precision. On impulse, maybe to make a point, maybe out of genuine frustration, she'd called out to him, and his answer had stopped her cold. "Not in a company that's selling its soul to buy its reputation." Now sitting in her office late that evening, Eleanor stared at the file her HR director had delivered. Daniel Ross, formerly senior analyst, terminated during the PrimeVest scandal, 2019. She remembered that scandal. It had happened just before she'd taken over as CEO. A fund collapse that wiped out millions. Someone had taken the fall. She'd never questioned who or why. She'd been too busy proving herself worthy of the CEO position. Now she read the details more carefully. Daniel had been the whistleblower. He'd discovered irregularities in the fund's accounting and reported them internally. 2 weeks later, those same irregularities had been blamed on him. He'd been terminated, publicly disgraced, and blacklisted from the industry. Eleanor closed the file, her hands trembling slightly. That evening, when the building was empty, she went down to the basement where Daniel was cleaning. He didn't look surprised to see her. "You used to work here," she said. Not a question. "I did," he replied simply. "Why did you say that? About the company selling its soul?" Daniel set down his mop. "Because I saw how it started. I saw good people make small compromises, then bigger ones, until they couldn't recognize themselves anymore. And you think that's what I'm doing? I think you're standing at the edge of that cliff. You can still step back." Eleanor studied him. "You lost everything because of this company." "I lost everything because I told the truth," Daniel corrected. "There's a difference." She noticed something then, the way he carried himself. Despite the janitor's uniform, despite the 6 years of disgrace, he still had dignity. "Why are you still here?" she asked. "Why work for the company that destroyed you?" Daniel pulled out his wallet and showed her a worn employee ID card. On the back, in a child's handwriting, were the words, "Dad, don't give up on your light." "My daughter wrote that," he said quietly. "She goes to school across the street. This job lets me walk her to school every morning. And every morning I remind myself that I didn't do anything wrong, that the truth matters even when no one believes it. Eleanor felt something crack inside her carefully constructed walls. "What if I told you I believed it?" she said. Daniel looked at her carefully. "Then I'd say you are braver than most people in this building." "Or more desperate," Eleanor replied. "Desperation and courage often look the same from the outside," Daniel said. "The difference is what you do next." Eleanor made a decision. "Tomorrow, my office, 7 a.m., bring whatever financial knowledge you still remember." "Why?" Daniel asked. "Because maybe I need someone who's already lost everything. Someone who has nothing left to lose by telling me the truth." The next morning, Financial News reported that Sterling Capital was preparing for Phase 2 of its IPO. Eleanor was exhausted from having to constantly prove her capabilities to a board of male shareholders who doubted she was anything more than good at marketing. Daniel continued his janitorial work, but his words had started circulating through the finance department. That evening, Eleanor found him in the janitor's area and set a cup of coffee in front of him. "If you were really an expert, prove it." Daniel opened his old laptop and pulled up the company's public filings. The company is about to go public, but 40% of the real shares are already held by an anonymous fund in the Cayman Islands. "Do you know who that is?" Eleanor frowned. "I'm the CEO, of course I know." "Then do you know they're shorting Sterling stock, waiting for you to fail so they can profit?" She went silent. This was something she'd suspected but hadn't dared to confirm. "They did this to me 6 years ago," Daniel continued, "when I still believed they were colleagues." Eleanor looked at him, beginning to understand. The Prime Vest scandal, the person who'd been blamed was Daniel. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because no one believes a janitor," he replied quietly. "What do you want from this?" "Nothing. I just want my daughter to know her father didn't give up." Over the next week, Eleanor secretly gave Daniel access to financial documents. He discovered a chain of anonymous emails between major shareholders and the CFO, discussing a plan to remove the CEO to clean up the IPO deal. The final email was signed with the initials RS. Eleanor felt ice in her veins. RS, Richard Sterling, her father, the company's founder, now supposedly retired. She sat in stunned silence as Daniel showed her the evidence. "Your father is orchestrating this?" Daniel asked. "My father built this company," Eleanor said, her voice hollow. "He handed it to me 5 years ago, or at least I thought he did." "He never let go," Daniel said. "He's been controlling it from the shadows. And now he's positioning to take it back." Eleanor looked at the emails, at her father's coded instructions, at the plan to discredit her and reinstall him as CEO. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would he do this?" "Because you're doing it differently than he did," Daniel said. "You're trying to build something sustainable, something ethical. That terrifies him." Eleanor stood and walked to the window, looking down at the city lights below. "When my son died," she said quietly, "my father told me to get over it. That grief was weakness. That if I wanted to lead this company, I had to be harder, colder, more ruthless." She turned to face Daniel. "I tried. God, I tried so hard to be what he wanted, but I couldn't. I kept seeing my son's face every time I made a ruthless decision." "That's not weakness," Daniel said. "That's humanity. In this world, they're the same thing. Only if you let them be." Eleanor made a decision. "We're going to need proof, real proof, the kind that can't be denied or explained away." "I can get that," Daniel said, "but it'll mean risking everything. If we're wrong or if we can't prove it, you'll lose the company, and I'll lose this job, which means I'll lose access to my daughter." Eleanor looked at him. "You'd risk that?" "I've been risking it every day for 6 years," Daniel said. "At least this time, I'm not fighting alone." They worked through the night, going through financial records, tracking money movements, building a case. Daniel's expertise became clear. He hadn't just been a good analyst. He'd been brilliant. He saw patterns no one else noticed, connections others missed. "How did they blame all this on you?" Eleanor asked as dawn broke. "They needed a fall guy," Daniel said simply. "I was convenient, young enough to destroy, competent enough to be believable as a scapegoat. I'm sorry, Eleanor said. I should have questioned it when I took over. You had just lost your son, Daniel replied. You were drowning. I don't blame you for not noticing me drowning too. By morning, they had assembled a file of evidence. Bank transfers, email chains, meeting recordings Daniel had kept from 6 years ago, showing he'd tried to warn people. This is enough to reopen your case, Eleanor said. You could clear your name. I will clear my name, Daniel said. But first we save your company, then we save my reputation. In that order. Why? Because your company employs 3,000 people. My reputation only affects me. The math is simple. Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt in years. Respect, admiration, and something else she didn't want to examine too closely. Daniel, she said, when this is over, whatever happens, I want you to know. I know, he interrupted gently. Let's just focus on making sure there is an after. Eleanor invited her father to her private residence. Richard Sterling was a silver-haired man in his 70s, still commanding despite his age. He'd built Sterling Capital from nothing, and he'd never really let it go. What do you want from me? Eleanor asked him directly. I want the company back in the hands of someone with a brain, not just a heart, Richard said coldly. Eleanor felt the words like a slap. You think I'm too weak. You think you're too soft, he corrected. Sterling Capital doesn't need a humanitarian. It needs a shark. And you think that's you? I know that's me, Richard said. You've done well, Eleanor. Better than I expected, honestly. But it's time to let the adults take over again. Eleanor forced herself to stay calm. What about Daniel Ross? Her father's expression didn't change. The janitor? What about him? You know exactly who he is. You orchestrated his downfall 6 years ago. He was in the way, Richard said dismissively. He had principles. Principles are expensive in this business. He was innocent. Innocence is a luxury we can't afford. Richard stood. Eleanor, I'm telling you this as your father. Step down gracefully. Take the generous severance package. Go find some charitable foundation to run. Let me restore this company to its proper glory. And if I refuse, Richard smiled coldly, then the board will vote you out. I have the shares. I have the votes. You'll lose it anyways, but it'll be public and humiliating. After he left, Daniel emerged from where he'd been listening in the next room. You heard all that? Eleanor asked. Every word. I have heard, Daniel confirmed. Now, do you believe me? Now I'm afraid, Eleanor admitted, because if I lose, you lose your job too. Daniel looked at her steadily. I lost years ago. This time it's your turn to win for both of us. They formulated a plan. Daniel analyzed internal data and discovered that Richard was using a private fund called Silver Arc to manipulate Sterling's stock, preparing to crash the price right before the IPO. Eleanor planned to present this evidence to the board. But then came the first twist. The CFO, Marcus Chen, someone Eleanor had trusted, betrayed her. He took all their evidence and delivered it to Richard, hoping to secure a promotion in the new regime. The board called an emergency meeting. Eleanor was suspended pending investigation. She sat in her apartment that night, defeated. Daniel found her there. We still have one move left. What move? Marcus took everything. Not everything, Daniel said. I made backups, every document, every email, every recording, including video of your father discussing this with Marcus. Eleanor looked at him in amazement. You backed everything up? I learned my lesson 6 years ago, Daniel said grimly. Never trust that the system will protect the truth. You have to protect it yourself. Where is it? Safe. On servers that can't access, ready to release if needed. Eleanor felt hope kindle again. So we can still fight. We can do more than fight, Daniel said. We can win. They prepared for the shareholder meeting where Richard planned to formally take control. The day arrived. The conference room was packed with shareholders, board members, and financial press. Richard stood at the podium, confident and commanding. Thank you all for coming. As you know, recent questions about leadership have emerged. I'm here to... The main screen suddenly lit up with Daniel's face. He was wearing an old but well-maintained suit. His hair was combed. He looked like the analyst he'd once been. "My name is Daniel Ross," he said. "6 years ago, I was a senior analyst at Sterling Capital. I discovered fraud in the Prime Vest Fund and reported it. 2 weeks later, I was blamed for that fraud and destroyed professionally." The room erupted in murmurs. "I didn't come forward then because I had no proof. They destroyed all my evidence, discredited me completely. But I've spent 6 years working as a janitor in this building, and during that time, I collected new evidence. Evidence of who really orchestrated the Prime Vest collapse. Evidence of who's orchestrating the current attempt to remove Eleanor Sterling." Richard's face went pale. "This is absurd. Security. The evidence is already with the SEC," Daniel continued, "and the FBI, and every major financial news outlet. You can silence me, but you can't silence all of them." Eleanor stood. "I'm reclaiming my position as CEO, and I'm appointing Daniel Ross as Chief Ethics Officer. Our first act will be a complete audit of all transactions over the past decade." The screen changed, showing documents, emails, bank transfers, all the evidence Daniel had collected. Richard tried to leave, but federal agents were already at the doors. "Richard Sterling, you're under arrest for securities fraud, market manipulation, and conspiracy." As they led him away, Richard looked at Eleanor. "You'll regret this. You're too weak to run this company." "No," Eleanor said quietly. "I'm strong enough not to become you." After the room cleared, Eleanor found Daniel standing alone by the window. "Thank you," she said, "for not giving up, for keeping the truth alive." "We just cleaned the floor," Daniel replied, "so we could see how clean the foundation really was." Eleanor laughed, the first real laugh she'd managed in years. "Is that a janitor metaphor?" "The best truths are simple," Daniel said. Eleanor took his hand. "You're not a janitor anymore. You're the Chief Ethics Officer of Sterling Capital. That comes with a corner office, a generous salary." "I'll take the salary," Daniel interrupted, "but I'm keeping my mop in the office. As a reminder." "Reminder of what?" "That the truth never gets dirty, only the people who try to hide it." 6 months later, Sterling Capital had transformed into Sterling Foundation, focusing on sustainable and ethical investments. Eleanor had restructured the entire company. The board now included ethics experts, community representatives, and people who'd been harmed by predatory financial practices. Daniel did take an office, but he refused the corner one. He took a modest space near the junior analysts where he could mentor them. "I don't want to be in an ivory tower," he explained. "That's how you lose touch with reality." Emma, Daniel's daughter, received a full scholarship from the Sterling Foundation Education Fund. She visited the office sometimes, and employees loved seeing her. One afternoon, Daniel found Eleanor standing on the rooftop terrace, looking out over the city. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked. "I was thinking about my father," she said. "About whether he'll ever understand why I did this." "Does it matter?" "It shouldn't, but he's still my father." Daniel stood beside her. "My daughter asked me once why I became a janitor instead of fighting back immediately. You know what I told her?" "What?" "That sometimes you have to start from the bottom to remember what matters. The view from the top can make you forget that real people are affected by every decision you make." Eleanor smiled. "Is that why you kept the mop in your office?" "The mop stays as a reminder, but also," Daniel paused, "also because it represents the 6 years I spent learning humility. I don't ever want to forget that lesson." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. "The company is doing well," Eleanor said. "Better than well. Our ethical investment fund outperformed traditional funds by 12% this quarter. Turns out people trust companies that are trustworthy," Daniel said. "Revolutionary concept." Eleanor laughed. "Who would have thought?" A junior analyst interrupted them. "Miss Sterling, the team from the Community Investment Project is here for their meeting." "Thank you, I'll be right there." Eleanor turned to Daniel. "Want to sit in? They're doing fascinating work in underserved neighborhoods." "Wouldn't miss it," Daniel replied. As they walked back inside, Eleanor said, "You know, 6 months ago, I thought power meant controlling everything. Now I'm learning it means empowering everyone." "That's not a small lesson," Daniel observed. I had a good teacher, Eleanor replied, a janitor who wasn't afraid to tell the CEO she was wrong. And a CEO who was brave enough to listen, Daniel countered. That evening, after the meetings concluded, Daniel picked up Emma from her after-school program. "How was work, Dad?" she asked. "Good. We're helping fund a new community center in Brooklyn." "That's cool. Can we visit it when it's built?" "Absolutely." Emma was quiet for a moment. "Dad, are you happy now?" Daniel thought about it. "You know what? I am. Not because everything is perfect, but because I'm doing work that matters with people I respect." "And Ms. Eleanor? Do you respect her?" Daniel smiled. "Very much," Emma grinned. "Good, I like her. She's nice." "She is." "And Dad, I'm proud of you for never giving up your light." Daniel remembered the words his daughter had written on his old ID card, the words that had kept him going through 6 years of humiliation and hardship. "I'm proud of you too, sweetheart, for being brave enough to believe in me when no one else did." They walked home hand in hand, father and daughter, through the streets of New York City. Above them, in the Sterling Foundation offices, lights still burned. Eleanor was working late, as usual. But now she wasn't working alone. Now she had a team of people who believed in the mission, who wanted to build something that would last it because it was built on truth. She looked at the framed mop handle on her wall, the one Daniel had given her as a joke, but which had become a symbol of the company's transformation. Under it was a plaque, "The truth never gets dirty." Eleanor smiled and got back to work. 1 year later, Sterling Foundation had become the most respected ethical investment fund in North America. In the company's lobby, there was a small museum of artifacts. Center stage was a framed janitor's mop with a plaque, "The truth never gets dirty." Daniel Ross, Chief Ethics Officer. Eleanor stood before it one morning, coffee in hand. Daniel joined her. "Still can't believe you made that into a shrine." "It's not a shrine, it's a reminder." "Of what?" "That wisdom can come from anywhere, that titles don't determine worth, that the person cleaning the floors might have more integrity than the person in the corner office." Daniel smiled. "That's a lot of meaning to extract from a mop." "It's a very meaningful mop," Eleanor replied seriously, then laughed. Emma ran up to them, her backpack bouncing. She was 11 now, bright and curious, thriving in her new school. "Dad, Ms. Eleanor, guess what? I want to be just like you when I grow up." "A janitor or a CEO?" Daniel teased. "Both," Emma declared. "I want to start at the bottom and work my way up, learning everything along the way. That way I'll never forget what really matters." Eleanor and Daniel exchanged looks. "She's smarter than both of us," Eleanor said. "Gets it from her dad," Daniel replied. "Gets it from everyone around her," Emma corrected. "Ms. Eleanor, you taught me that power should be used to help people. Dad taught me that losing doesn't mean staying down. Together, you taught me that the best teams are built on truth." Eleanor knelt down to Emma's level. "You're going to do amazing things, Emma. I can't wait to see it." "Maybe I'll run Sterling Foundation someday," Emma said. "Maybe you will," Eleanor agreed. "And if you do, you'll do it even better than I did." After Emma ran off to her class, Eleanor and Daniel walked to the windows overlooking the city. "Do you ever miss it?" Eleanor asked. "The old life? Before the scandal?" "Sometimes," Daniel admitted. "I miss the certainty, the simplicity of thinking I understood how the world worked. And now? Now I know the world is complicated, but I also know that truth always finds a way to surface. It might take 6 years, it might take 60, but it comes out eventually." Eleanor nodded. "My father's trial starts next week. Are you going to attend?" "I don't know. Part of me wants to. Part of me never wants to see him again." "He's still your father. He tried to destroy me." "People are complicated," Daniel said. "Even the ones who hurt us." Eleanor sighed. "When did you become so wise?" 6 years of mopping floors gives you time to think." They stood together, watching the city wake up below them. "You know what the best part is?" Eleanor said. "What?" "We did this, not through manipulation or power plays or dirty tricks. We did it by telling the truth and letting the truth win." "That's not just the best part," Daniel said. That's the only part that matters." In the lobby below, visitors stopped to read the plaque under the frame mop. Some smiled, some took pictures, some stood quietly, thinking about their own workplaces, their own compromises, their own moments of truth. The mop had become famous. News articles had been written about it. Business schools taught case studies about the Sterling Reformation. But for Eleanor and Daniel, it was simpler than that. It was just a reminder that sometimes the person lowest in the room carries the highest truth. That wisdom wears many uniforms, and that the most powerful thing you can do is choose integrity over convenience. Every single time. The foundation thrived. Emma grew up. Years passed. But the mop stayed on the wall, and the truth stayed at the center of everything they built. Because that's what legacies are made of. Not corner offices or profit margins, but the courage to speak truth to power, even when you're holding a mop. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe to Strong Dad Stories. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten.